Fruits Basket is a manga series from the 90s that has two anime adaptations, one from 2001 and one in 2019 that was a reboot. And then it even got a prelude OVA movie. And it also has a 4-volume spin-off manga. All of these things I have consumed multiple times. Fruits Basket is my favorite piece of media that has ever graced this wonderful earth, and while I could talk about the series as a whole for so long and tell you how much it means to me and why I've spent so many years of my life fixated on it, I'm gonna save that for a future video. Instead, I'm gonna start small and we'll start with an analysis on my favorite character of all time, Kyo Sohma. There will be spoilers ahead, so please watch with caution. While I think a lot of the characters in this show are extremely well written, like the main trio, which I think are the 3 best, Akito, Shigure, etc., and the last thing I want to do here is compare the characters' trauma since everybody reacts to it differently, and that's not the goal here. But, bias aside, I do truly believe Kyo to be one of, if not the best written characters with the best development in the series. On the surface, he looks like your typical tsundere type of character, which is why even when the anime ends, people seem to always downplay his trauma and personality and just chalk him up to that. But here's why I think he's so much more. He goes from a literal, hissing, spitting, feral cat who blamed himself for every bad thing that happened to anyone he cared about, to someone warm who has learned to live with his trauma and even started to take the steps to heal from it. He takes accountability for the things that are his fault and tries to let go of the things that are not, and actively begins to make plans for his life even before he's told that he's allowed to live it. He's one of the few, if not only, characters whose personality completely changes and does a 180 for the better. He is such a deep, complex character who often gets overlooked and his trauma swept under the rug and, like I said, boiled down to a quote-unquote tsundere bad boy, when in reality, Kyo is honestly the opposite of that stereotype entirely. While he may have some aspects of that archetype, I do not think that it really fits him down to a T, because most of the time characters like that are just constantly always angry and lashing out and always like that throughout the entire show. And yes, it can be because of their trauma, but however, as we get into later, Kyo is not always like that. Kyo is essentially what I like to call double cursed. What I mean by this is, not only does he turn into a cat and is affected by the generational trauma of the Sohma family, but he is the only zodiac member with another form as well as his cat form. When his beads are off, he turns into this stinky, grotesque monster, and I like to believe this is because of how the curse started from the very beginning, due to the cat's original actions by defying the god's wishes and then being shunned by the other animals. This also plays a major factor in how he acts. I also like to think that the author did this on purpose because the cat wasn't even part of the original 12 zodiac animals, and this was just kind of her play of like doubly cursing him somehow. Back to his personality, let's take Yuki for example. He goes through major character development as well, but his personality never really changes, at least not as drastically as Kyo's. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying you should change as much as Kyo has to be considered to have the best development, but Kyo stuck out way more to me because of that, among other reasons. Kagura also points this out to us as well in Season 2. She says that Kyo didn't always used to be the angry boy that we know and love from Season 1. She said he was gentle and kind as a child, which, as we see from Season 3 after he heals, that's exactly the kind of person he is at his core. Under all that anger, he's playful, relaxed, and even quick with a joke. His trauma and struggles cause him to be the angry kid who lashes out at everybody. Kagura was his first and only friend throughout childhood, and although, like Kazuma, her love for Kyo started out as guilt because she failed to do what Toru does when she sees his true form. But it grows to be genuine, and even if Kyo seems to be tired of her beating him all the time, and let's be honest, who wouldn't, I know deep down that he values her so much for holding out her hand to him as a child and still being here nonetheless. As I've noticed throughout my rewatches and rereads, whenever Kyo lashes out, he does indeed regret it almost instantly. He isn't great at apologizing, which is why whenever he tries to, it never really goes his way, but he does try his best to make things right in his own unique way. If he weren't manipulated at such a young age, surely he would have acted different, and I truly believe that to my core. People tend to forget that his anger and remorse is a reaction to trauma, and everybody has different responses to trauma, and this is Kyo's. He doesn't have a control on his emotions because he's so used to being hurt and blamed for things that he didn't do or were out of his control. He didn't have anyone to talk to about his troubles, therefore not learning how to cope in a healthy way, resulting into him becoming a closed-off ball of anger, essentially, who is so used to isolating himself and running away whenever he has an issue. Due to this, he does not plan on getting close to anybody. And although one would argue that, okay, yes, he had Kazuma, whereas someone like Yuki didn't have anybody like that, that doesn't mean Kyo really had a person to talk to, because if we all know Kyo, he does not really open up about his feelings, at least not at first. Throughout his life, Kyo believes all he ever does is hurt others, whether that's due to him lashing out, or because that's what he was led to believe. Either way, this greatly affects Kyo's actions and feelings. Kyo not only witnessed 2 deaths at such a young age and got blamed for both of them, one of which being his own intrusive thoughts and beliefs, but he was also manipulated by the man that was supposed to be his father. He was told that everything was his fault, that he was a monster, and that he will never truly be welcomed or accepted by anybody, especially by people in his own family. Essentially, they made Kyo to be the scapegoat of the family, someone to look down upon and think, well, at least I'm not him. There was a time where Kyo was so desperate to be accepted into the family and to just be invited to things like the Zodiac banquet, for example, that Akito gave him a false promise with a bet, and that bet was that if he beat the rat, Yuki, in a fight, he wouldn't get locked away in isolation forever, and he would be accepted as a true member of the Zodiac family. Now, while we will get into the very obvious other reasons why Kyo hates Yuki, I believe that after this bet had happened, I think that one of the reasons why Kyo had always lashed out at Yuki was because he was trying to fight for his life and his own happiness. That's not confirmed, and probably not even canon, but that's just what I like to think sometimes. So, in general, all of these things would have a huge effect on anybody, especially being told these things as a literal child. Kyo was suicidal, angry, and hormonal, and if you were in his shoes, I don't think he'd be the nicest person either. This is why his first meeting with Yuki was very heartbreaking. He essentially blames Yuki for his troubles, which isn't true of course, but Kyo was manipulated into thinking this. He thought if he didn't have anyone to hate, what was left of him? And also, he was told that just because he's not the rat, that means he won't be as loved, and he would look down upon because he was the cat. If he had been the rat, then maybe, just maybe, he would be loved. At the first glance of that meeting, it looks like Kyo is just being an ass, because saying what he did to someone that young would make anybody pissed off, but you have to remember, it wasn't entirely his fault. Kyo and Yuki are foils of each other. They are envious of the other, which only flared their hatred for one another, because Kyo can't understand why Yuki hates what Kyo wants, and vice versa. Kyo wants to be accepted into the family, and Yuki doesn't. Yuki wants genuine relationships outside of the family, and Kyo, it's not that he doesn't, but that's not really what's important to him, whereas it's very important for Yuki. The cat and rat spirits have always hated each other since the very first story of the Zodiacs, and even if that's true for their cases as well, when you really delve deeper into their interesting relationship, you will notice that, although subtle, they do look out for one another through Toru's influence. Though, obviously, that isn't always how it was. Like I said before, when Kyo first meets Yuki, the thing he says to him is that he doesn't want Yuki to be alive. But he also didn't want himself to be either. Like, what kind of child tells their father that they're going to kill someone and then themselves so that'll make everybody happy? It's a huge burden for anybody, but especially for a kid. Kyo really thought he was good for nothing, who would only upset others, and from the way his childhood has been, that's what was shown to him. The only person he was ever vulnerable and close to besides Toru was Kazuma Sohma, his adoptive father. But even then, Kyo's first thought was that Kazuma was being forced into it. Kazuma teaches Kyo that there are people in the world who won't reject him like he'd believed, but it took Kyo a bit of time to finally understand that. This is when, as a child, Kyo meets Kyoko Honda, who also helps him out, and reaches her hand out to him, when at the time he never thought anybody would ever do that to him. So unknowingly, Kyoko also helps Kyo out. Although Kyo didn't quite feel as vulnerable to her as he did with Kazuma, he certainly felt somewhat safe and comfortable with her. This is when Kyoko then shows Kyo a picture of her daughter Toru, whom he formally meets later on. Though, unfortunately, not only does Kyo see his own mother take her life and then get blamed for it, but he also witnesses the murder of Kyoko, Toru's mother. Kyo then believes that Kyoko had blamed him for her death because what he doesn't know is that Kyoko was having an inner monologue, and basically saying essentially that if he didn't protect her, she would never forgive him. Obviously, the only words that came out of her mouth was that I won't forgive you, so then Kyo in turn takes it as her blaming him for dying. This makes Kyo spiral and feel even worse about his entire existence. Not only was it because of the fact he had a chance to save her by pulling her back so she wouldn't get hit by the car, but then he couldn't because he would turn into a cat, but also because of everything else he's been through since he was born. This had taken a huge toll on Kyo's mentality, and why wouldn't it? So then when he eventually meets Toru, he essentially internally says, fuck, because he thinks this is the world punishing him for, quote-unquote, killing her mother. And because of this, Kyo has no intention of getting close to her, or really anyone for that matter, but more specifically her. So much so that he refuses to even say her name, that is until the true form arc. Slowly but surely though, Toru helps him just by simply loving all of him and accepting him, and he ends up changing for the better. He didn't need Toru to erase or fix his problems, and even Kyo says that that's not what he needed. What he needed was someone to stay and to accept every part of him, even if they were afraid. And when it mattered the most, someone did. That's an aspect about the relationship I really like a lot, because it shows that people don't need fixing. What they need is for somebody to help them by their side and root for them and support them while they're dealing with their own trauma. So because of Toru's acceptance, he changes for himself and for the people around him. One thing I want to touch upon briefly is the reason why Toru stayed and so desperately wanted Kyo to come back to the house. So Toru says that she stays with Kyo and tries to get him to come back to the house because, in her own words, she was afraid that he would never come back to the house ever. And that broke me because to me, it felt like the story was telling us that Kyo would have taken his own life if this had failed. And if you think about it, what other outcome could there have been? The only trusted person in his life just betrayed him by ripping off his beads in front of the one person that he wanted to hide it from. And if Toru had been the next person to not accept him, I truly do think it would have broken him beyond repair. But she does. And when Toru accepts Kyo's true form, that's when he finally says her name, as I mentioned before, meaning that Kyo is letting himself grow close to her. One of Kyo's biggest problems is not letting himself accept his true feelings, hence his love for Toru. He wasn't planning on becoming her boyfriend because even if he was getting better and believing people can accept him, he still didn't believe he would be loved or even had the right to fall in love himself. This was a huge thing for Kyo to come to terms with, and honestly, I believe it was also one of the key factors into breaking the curse. Once he finally learned that it was okay with what he was feeling, and decided to do something for himself and do something about his love for Toru, the curse finally broke, and the burden from the past became no more. He was finally truly free and became happy. The sweet Kyo that Kazuma and Kagura had always known. He even stood up to his abusive father and fought for his future, which is something Kyo never would have done if not for his healing journey. And then he even grew to become great friends with the one he was told to hate, Yuki Sohma. Kyo standing up to his dad was probably my favorite part of his arc because it was just so satisfying to essentially see him tell his father to fuck off and that he was going to fight for his future. Every time I read it in the manga or watch it in the anime, it brings me to tears. That and the part where he rips his beads off when the curse breaks, like, it gets me every time. It's just so metaphorically beautiful, and nothing will ever truly make me feel the bliss that I did when I watched those scenes, honestly. There are so many things I can say about Kyo and why he's so beloved and dear to me, but I'll keep it short and sweet. He simply just means so much to me. He is the one character I relate to the most out of any media I've consumed, and I can see a lot of myself in. So, because of his story hitting so close to home, it really inspires me to do better and take my own healing journey, and it lets me to believe that maybe, just maybe, things can get better, no matter how much worse it may get before you reach that destination. And this is why I like to recommend people to watch Fruits Basket or read Fruits Basket, because I truly think that at any age, no matter what you're going through, you can always get something out of this. You can always learn something and get some sort of advice, and it'll change your life for the better. I really do think this is the anime to watch when you're feeling down or when you're going through something, or even if you just need a little pick-me-up, because every character is unique and special in their own way, and you can find lots of advice if you just know where to look. Fruits Basket truly has never failed to just help me out or make me feel better about something, even if I'm not even going through anything that they talk about in the show. Just watching it just fills me with so much comfort. One of my daily mottos now is thinking, what would Toru do? All this to say, At first, Kyo was just a silly, angry catboy to me who I found some comfort in, and then when I really delved into the anime and manga and learned his backstory and daily struggles, it all just clicked. I knew instantly Kyo would have a special place in my heart for the end of time after that. He was always my favorite, but now it's like he's a part of me, truly. I don't go anywhere without wearing my very own identical beaded bracelet.